My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the second panel of our symposium on religion in American politics and society, where we'll be focusing on the Muslim experience. For those of you who weren't here for the first panel, just a couple of words of background. This symposium has been organized by my colleague Tom Farr. It is supported by the Henry Luce Foundation and the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. It's the last, really, of a series of several symposia over several years on the broader issue of religion in American society and politics and its international implications. I invite you to learn some more about the center, and in particular about a new project that Tom is leading, the Religious Freedom Project. We've got some materials at the back table and on some of your chairs. The topic today, as you know, is about the American model, if we can call it that, of the relationship between religion, society, and politics. Really, two themes we've already seen explored this morning: non-establishment, the fact that there is no established official religion in the United States; free exercise, the fact that constitutionally, but also historically, right up to the present, religious communities have been free not just to profess their faith, but to be engaged at the level of civil society, in politics, domestic politics, foreign policy, and the like. And the idea behind the symposium is to hear from different religious communities, people who are part of different religious communities, about their experience with this model, to debate its flaws, its strengths, and to think together about whether it can serve, should serve, does serve as a model for other societies. And that, of course, is a critical theme now, in particular in the context of the revolutions now sweeping the Arab world. I'm really delighted that for this panel we've assembled three very distinguished speakers, and you have their bios already. I will give a couple of words of introduction here at the outset, and they'll speak in the order on the program. Ed Husain is with us from the Council on Foreign Relations, where he serves as a senior fellow. He's published widely on issues of Islam, politics, society, and foreign policy, and his next book, entitled The Sufis, is due out next year. Our second panelist, Imam Feisal Abdul Rauf, is founder and chairman of the New York-based Cordoba initiative, and of course a leading public figure who has published widely on issues of Islam and society in the United States. I'll just mention one of his books with the provocative title, What's Right with Islam is What's Right with America. And of course, he's known to many of you in connection with his work on the project to create an Islamic center in New York near Ground Zero. Our third panelist, Asma Uddin, is an international legal fellow at the Becket Fund here in Washington, D.C. She's also founder and editor-in-chief of a blog, altmuslima.com, that focuses on gender issues from a variety of cultural and religious and political perspectives. She's also associate editor and legal columnist for Islamica and a panelist with Washington Post's On Faith site. So we have a tremendous panel. The way we're going to do this is with 10 minutes of introductory remarks from each of our panelists, and I will try to keep them to that so that we have plenty of time for discussion. So with that, thank you all for coming, and let's turn to Ed Husain.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by thanking Tom Farr for inviting me, and thank you all for making time this morning. But before I respond directly to the three questions, my response will be brief, but I hope instructive. I just want to, for less than a minute, reflect on something that the previous panel talked about and more or less left in division, as it were. And with all respect to the previous panel, I speak as a Muslim who's often rightly or wrongly described as a moderate, although I don't particularly like that term. And I think I was involved in setting up an organization, a counter-extremism organization, what you would perhaps call a moderate organization, in the United Kingdom immediately after 7/7 and the London tube bombings. Now, I was involved with a whole host of Islamist organizations in my teenage years, but after returning from Saudi Arabia and Syria and starting up this organization in Britain, it was the embrace, the caveated, thoughtful embrace of the British government that allowed my organization to go from being what was initially a small voice to being by far the most impactful, relevant, cutting edge, and I'm not exaggerating when I say the organization that had access to shaping Prime Minister Cameron's recent speech in Munich. So I think government engagement or Western government support for Muslim organizations, be they in the West or be they in the East, done properly with understandings of introductions, patronage, advice, access, and not always about money, is what helps shape, I think, discussions and debates. And two other small examples before I start on the bulk of it. Sa'ad Ibrahim in Egypt, Ayman Noor in Egypt, both were arrested, and it was Condi Rice's, I think, last visit to Egypt when she raised the plight of political prisoners that put these people on the political maps throughout the world. That was 3 years ago. Look where we are today in Egypt. With those few remarks, I think it's not whether Western governments ought to embrace moderates or not, it's how the embracing happens that then yields the kind of results that it does or does not. Now that I've got that off my chest, I can turn to the first question, which was what's the proper role or what is the proper role for religious ideas and actors in the political life of the nation? I think Muslims have been contesting the role of religious ideas and actors in political life for nearly a millennium. And that's longer than the debate here in the West for the last 500 years. With the advent of secular democracy in the West and its increasing impact on the Muslim East, the role of Sharia-informed ideas in Muslim-majority states remains contentious. Fortunately, there is no one Sharia or singular interpretation of Islam that can be considered, quote-unquote, proper, and therefore legitimate to uphold in legal and policy debates. Muslims, like others, can cite scriptural justifications for a host of specific scientific, economic, and foreign policy questions. Moving away from specifics, the Sunni Muslim ulama, or traditional scholars, have bequeathed to us a credible, scripturally rooted, and relevant approach to understanding the role of Sharia in public life. The great Imam al-Juwayni, who died in 1085 Christian era, 1,000 years ago, Imam al-Juwayni, who was the teacher of Muhammad al-Ghazali and others, wrote extensively about what's called in Islam as the maqasid, or the aims of the Sharia. Maqasid spelled M-A-Q-A-S-I-D for those of you who are taking notes. The specifics were left to each society, but the general principles, or the maqasid, the aims of the Sharia, were 5 things. And it was Imam al-Shatibi, who died in 1388, who clarified these 5 things. Imam Shatibi, S-H-A-T-I-B-I, one of the great Muslim jurisprudence of the past 900 years, categorized these 5 aims of maqasid of the Sharia to be as follows: the preservation of religion, the preservation of life, of lineage, of intellect, and property. So once again, preservation of life, religion, lineage, intellect, and property are the 5 things that the Sharia aims to preserve and protect in society. Contemporary Muslim ulama such as Sheikh Abdul bin Bayya argue that any society that protects religion, life, lineage, intellect, and property is essentially an Islamic society. So the entire debate about the caliphate and about the Islamic State is finished here in terms of whichever society upholds and protects these 5 elements is essentially, in the view of a great Islamist jurist today, Sheikh Abdul bin Bayya, is an Islamic society. The specifics of religious rulings on abortion or stem cell research can be understood from the maqasid with a clear priority for preserving human life where there is scientific evidence that human life has begun. And we're blessed, I think, as Muslims when the Prophet Muhammad taught us that Antum a'lamu bi umuri dunyakum, that you know about the affairs of this world. In other words, the Prophet Muhammad's mission for us Muslims was an otherworldly mission, unless where it impacted this world. But his broad guideline principle was, we know as people of this world what's best for us in this world. An indication to Muslims that on all matters worldly, we refer to the relevant experts and within the framework of the broad maqasid. Question 2 then, should conscientious religious objections be accommodated in law and policy? I think respect for conscientious religious objections is essential to any society based on human dignity, rights, freedom, and the rule of law. In principle, therefore, religious objections merit an opt-out situation in public life, but the seriousness of the objection should determine the validity of exercising this fundamental human right. This is a difficult area of law and policy to navigate, but in line with maqasid approaches to understanding Sharia, the preservation of life is the foundational principle on which religion, intellect, property, and lineage are based. A conservative Catholic medical practitioner, therefore, it seems to me, is fully within the human and religious rights to refuse to work in or support the work of an abortion facility in a major public hospital. Similarly, a Jehovah's Witness may refuse to serve in the armed forces, even during national conscription or wartime. Indeed, many witnesses were imprisoned in Nazi Germany for refusing to bear arms for principled religious reasons. But what then of the Muslim taxi driver in London who refuses a blind man's guide dog to enter a cab and then claims conscientious religious objection on the grounds that he considers dogs to be ritualistically impure? Or Mormons objecting to legal guidance on marriage and practicing polygamy on the grounds of conscientious religious objection? The widespread and often farcical use of conscientious objections can undermine the rule of law. This is a delicate and sensitive area of law and public policy which can only be responded to based on the appropriate context, I think. The guiding principle, therefore, for many Muslims at least, is the maqasid foundation of the seriousness of the claim to religious objections and whether it saves lives and prevents injustice occurring in society. Muslim ulama or jurists refer to this assessment process as maslaha, or public benefit. So in conclusion, I think much depends on the circumstances and why and where. Question 3 was, is the dominant American approach to religion, society, and the state worthy of emulation in other countries? With revolutionary uprisings across the Arab world as we speak, the dominant American approach to religion, society, and the state, I think, is a gift to future Muslim writers of state constitutions, provided we do not see an increase in the continued hostility towards places of worship in Muslim worship in America. I think often people here in America fail to understand how much impact the kind of storm we saw around Imam Feisal's institution and the negative backlash that has in, or the proposed institution, the negative backlash that has in Muslim majority countries. Arab states such as Tunisia and Turkey emulated the extreme secularism of France, only to be frustrated by the mismatch of peoples, cultures, history, and religion. Britain offered a compromise with an established church within a less rigorously secular state. But the decline of religiosity in public discourse in Britain, and by extension Europe, makes European models unappealing for tomorrow's Muslim statecrafters. Uniquely in the West, it is America that has a pluralist model in which religious freedom is cherished and God remains, ostensibly at least, central to personal and public life. The Establishment Clause, in one stroke, undermines the raison d'etre of those who wish to impose their literalist, confrontational, specificities-led interpretation of statist Islam. Political Islamists of all hues. And this is an absolutely vital point. The establishment of Islam in Muslim-majority countries has been the clarion call of Islamist organizations and jihadist organizations for the past 80 years. And the American Constitution and its attitude, direct, blunt attitude towards establishment, I think, or disestablishment of religion, deals a lethal blow to this entire movement. They are compelled to moderate and move away from their grand project of establishing Islam to advancing arguments and engaging with the state on policy and law, not imposing an Islamist interpretation of Sharia. While that is a welcome contribution to Muslim majority societies, religious freedom and proselytism, and its opposite, apostasy, are areas where there is little sanity or maqasid-based consensus among Muslims. US foreign policy in the broadest sense possible, including public diplomacy initiatives and other non-state actors, have yet to convince Muslim communities around the world that religious freedom is anything other than a license for Christian missionary activities. For me, the vitally important arguments are of ejecting state influences from religious life and discourse, protecting religious minorities as a principled hallmark of civilization in Muslim countries, extending the reciprocity principle so that building churches and synagogues in Muslim-majority countries becomes the norm, and these crucial arguments, I think, are yet to begin. If US foreign policy can help, not hinder, then all the better for us. Thank you for listening.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to be here, to see many good friends, Reverend Jim Wallace, Marshall Brager, David Saperstein, a lot of you here who are old friends. And it's indeed a pleasure to share with you observations about the American experience and about the intersection of religion and state, or church and state. I strongly believe that a lot of the discourse around the issue of intersection of church and state, or Islam and state, are fraught with a lot of misunderstandings. And therefore, the first task at hand is for us to understand what we mean by the terms that we use. To give a very important example of this, in the United States, it has become almost a religious belief of the concept of separation of church and state. And it's an important one in this country. But I remember a few years ago in Davos, Jack Straw saying, I don't know what the Americans' hold of separation of church and state is all about. I appoint bishops. The Church of the Queen is the head of the Church of England. There's no separation of church and state in England. But as a friend of mine, Professor Ali Mazrui, very pointedly made in one of those regional Davos meetings, he said there's a difference between separation of church and state and separation of religion and politics. In England, there is no separation of church and state, but there is a distinct separation from religion and politics. This is how we described it. Rather, the point really to be defined well is the politicization of religion. So we need to unpack these terms and understand where the key concepts lie. What we mean in America by the separation of church and state is not that we do not promote religion. In fact, when I came in the 60s, this was the general belief that, religion does not belong. Religion is a crutch for the weak. And as a friend of mine who passed away a couple of years ago, Reverend Sloane Coffin, said, if religion is a crutch, why do I see so many lame people? Why are you limping? The real issue is that the coercive powers of the state should not be used to further one religion against another, or to eliminate one aspect of religious interpretation. An issue that has been the bane not only of Christian society but also Muslim societies. As early as the 8th century or 9th century, during the time of the Caliph Ma'mun, he used the coercive powers of his rule to enforce the idea that the Quran was created. It was a big issue, a very controversial issue, akin to the discussions in the Christian world as to whether Jesus, as the Word of God, was co-eternal with God or a creation of God. And people would kill each other over such issues of belief. But what evolved at that time was a sense that the caliph, as the chief executive or head of state, should not be involved in issues of religion. And the matters of religion should be left to the fuqaha, the experts or the doctors of law and religion. The evil of the politicization of religion is really something which is wrong and against the fundamental principles of all of our faith traditions. The Quran is explicit that there shall be no coercion in religion. And therefore, a state governed by the principles of Islam, namely the Quran and the teachings of our Prophet, would protect all religions. And that was in fact the history of much of early Islamic rule. When many people forget, for instance, that the Jews who were banned or banished from Jerusalem in 70 AD by the Romans did not return until the Caliph Omar, at the time the Caliph Omar conquered Jerusalem and invited 70 Jewish families to take residence in the city of David. And when after the First Crusade, Muslims and Jews and even Orthodox Christians were banned from Jerusalem, it wasn't until Saladin reconquered Jerusalem that Jews and Muslims and all the various Orthodox faiths returned to take up their residence in Jerusalem, a town important to all, faiths and all manifestations and interpretations of both Christianity and Islam. And under historic Islamic rule until about a century ago, both under Mughal rule and under Ottoman rule, you had all the varieties and interpretations of the religions, Orthodox, Catholic, you name it, various interpretations of Islam and Islamic law thrived together under a system which allowed such freedom of expression to be taken even to this extent of freedom of courts. That was where each community could even have its own courts ruling by its own systems of beliefs and jurisprudence, somewhat analogous to the Beit Din in the United States, which allows Jews to decide issues of Jewish personal law within the domain of American law and be considered legally binding according to by applying the system of arbitration. So broadly speaking, the fundamentals of Islamic law insist that freedom of religion must be protected. There shall be no coercion in religion, which therefore believes that individuals should be allowed the freedom to experiment with other religions and to convert. And even on the issue of apostasy, I've had discussions with a dear friend of mine who passed away a few months ago, Professor Mahmoud Ghazi, who was in the Supreme Sharia Court of Pakistan, and who pointed out, as others have pointed out, that the issue of apostasy really was the combination of treason. It was in the context where apostasy meant treason at the time of the Prophet. And when there was no longer a period of war, the Prophet did not allow even people to apostatize based upon his decision in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah with those who were fighting the Prophet and the small nascent religion of Muslims. He agreed in the agreement to return to the people who converted to Islam, to require them to go back and to turn them back to the. So it's not really about belief, it's more about treason, which until even a few years ago in this country was considered a capital offense. We also should respect others' religious beliefs. I believe that the insulting or mocking of others' religious symbols, icons, symbols, prophets, etc., should not fall within the realm of free speech. Mocking people, insulting people, I think falls almost into the arena of libel. Responsible, free speech must equal responsible speech. The politicization of religion has resulted not only in problems between Islam and other faith traditions, but also within the community of Islam, something which we did not see a century ago. It wasn't until the politicization of religion about a century ago that we have seen the conflicts which we have seen between Hindus and Muslims. Which has created the state of Pakistan, created a lot of problems in South Asia. The creation of state of Israel and the problems, the politicization between Judaism and Islam has resulted in massive population shifts. We had Jews who lived for centuries in almost every Muslim country, Morocco, Yemen, Syria, even Afghanistan, had their populations and communities of Jews, and the unfortunate politicization of religion has resulted in very deep negative relations, which is truly unfortunate. I'd like to just conclude by, and also, I'm so sorry, today within Islam, between Sunnis and Shias, see what's happening right now in Iraq, in Pakistan, where Sunnis are bombing Shias when they even in their Friday prayers, something absolutely horrific. This is all a result of the dynamics of the politicization of religion, which is something which I believe the American experience is all about avoiding. The concept Islamic State, I also believe that Islamic political parties, although they were begun and initiated as a result of a desire to establish the Islamic principles of justice, are an incoherent idea. It began about a century ago. In fact, I have convened about 5 years ago a working group of scholars of Sharia, of Islamic jurisprudence, from Morocco to Indonesia, to seek to understand the concept Islamic State. Because the term has been utilized over the last century increasingly in a very incoherent manner. And while there are political parties, Islamic political parties, whose objective is to establish something called the Islamic State, there has never been a really detailed explanation or definition of what that means. And the definitions which have become dominant are a mishmash of demographic definitions. We have an organization called the Organization of Islamic Conference, consisting of 57 majority Muslim states. And you have in it secular countries like Turkey and Indonesia, and countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, very different countries. The only common bond is that they are majority Muslim. Very different systems of government. Some are republics, some are monarchies, some are autocratic, a lot of them are. But what does it mean then to be an Islamic State? And the experiments of the Taliban and in parts of Iran, in some circles in Iran, the emphasis has been on the application of the penal code. That is about as coherent as saying, if you want to establish a US-style democracy, let's punish people the way Americans punish people, and the US-style democracy will flow automatically. It sounds as absurd as it sounds. This has been, in some countries, the rationale behind applying the Islamic State, or the way we dress. We have to wear the niqab or the hijab or have a beard in order to have an Islamic State, rather than the principles of justice. While there were differences of opinion among our scholars, the idea of this project was to get consensus among a working group of scholars on how to define an Islamic State, benchmark the definition of an Islamic State from the point of view of Islamic jurisprudence, and then seek to give these criteria a way of measuring them, so we could actually measure states and rate them to how Sharia compliant they were, so to speak. There were differences of opinion, strong differences of opinion, as to how whether a state should declare Islam as a state religion or not. Understandably, the gentleman from Pakistan insisted it should. Those from Turkey and Indonesia insisted it shouldn't. There were differences of opinion on issues like this, but they were all unanimous on a set of things. Primarily, that the Islamic State is one in which the concept of the caliphate or khilafah comes from the American, what we call in America the concept of we the people. Because in the Quran, God announces to the angels before the creation of Adam that I'm going to place on earth a khalifa, a successor to me. And therefore, all of us, all of humanity, comprises the representatives of God on earth. And therefore, that the issue of divine sovereignty, which is the defining aspect of an Islamic state, is defined by two major aspects. A, the sovereignty of the people, which is the concept of we the people, which we read about in our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. And also the assurance that any laws are not against the divine law, which is by definition Sharia. So analogous to when we say the state or the legislature, Congress, enacts a law, that it should not be unconstitutional. It doesn't mean that it is a law written in the Constitution, but does not go against any principle in the Constitution. Otherwise, it can be struck out as being legal. These are the two prime aspects within the principle of justice, and that these two aspects will actually balance justice, and then they amplify justice into its components, subcomponents of political justice, economic justice, social justice, etc. And the five principles which we added that talked about the maqasid of the Sharia, the objectives of the Sharia, were something which had to be furthered. In fact, there was even a strong suggestion by some of the participants that if we assure that these objectives of the Sharia were fulfilled, that justice would automatically happen. And we added one more, a sixth, to the objectives of the Sharia. This comes from the notion that Muslim jurists have agreed upon, that all of laws can be broken into two parts. In fact, that all of law, all of the Sharia, is to further what is called masalih al-ibad, the interests of human beings or of the creatures in this life and in the next life. This flows actually from both the Jewish law and the Christian law. When Jesus was asked, what are the greatest commandments? For those of you who remember the Bible, he said, to love the Lord thy Lord with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength. I'm combining two different quotations in two different Gospels. And then he said, the second commandment, which is like unto it, is to love thy neighbor as thyself. And then Jesus adds, upon these two commandments hang all of the law and all of the prophets. Islamic law basically is founded and flows from these two principles. Therefore, Muslim jurists divided all laws into two aspects, or they divide them in different ways. One is to ibadat, acts of worship. The other category, acts of towards creation. But then they said that they unpacked the objectives of the interest of human beings and us as khalifas of God, as God's stewards, to use Christian language on earth, is to protect and further 6 objectives. We added one more. The furtherance and protection of life, of dignity, al-arad, this is the 6th one we added, of intellect, of family, of property, and of religion. And I commissioned Gallup to try and see how they can measure and poll. After a year's worth of work, they said we couldn't do it scientifically. So I commissioned 2 Columbia University professors to see if we can benchmark and measure the maqasid. They said it is easier, let's do the first lower hanging fruit first. We measured 3, property, intellect, and life, and we rated countries. And I shall conclude with this because I think I'm out of time. The highest scoring countries on these 3 of the 6 maqasid were the Western countries. Thank you very much.
As Tom noted earlier, I wear a number of hats that are relevant to this discussion. But the one I wanted to start with was my role as the founder and editor of a web magazine called Alt-Muslima, which is an online magazine that deals with questions of gender in Islam. And this web magazine is ultimately rooted in my own personal struggle growing up Muslim in America and dealing with a lot of complex issues, both with regard to studying my religion and also hearing constantly what the media was telling me about Islam oppressing women, and it created a lot of internal turmoil and a lot of struggles when it came to the question of gender and faith. Because here I was, a deeply devout Muslim, but also somebody who felt very strongly about women's equality and equal women's dignity. And what this Alt-Muslim is rooted in that experience, and ultimately what it is a public forum where other Muslim Americans from across the nation, in fact, Muslims from across the world, can come and participate in that dialogue. And it's a very free and open discourse that at times become controversial and at times pushes the envelope. And ultimately, I think that what this experience of Alt-Muslim, the experience of creating it and sharing that dialogue and discussion with so many other people, for me, ultimately encapsulates the Muslim experience of religion in America. this idea that we do have this a safe space for open discourse is completely public and open, and unlike many other places around the world, this sort of discourse that does push the envelopes, that does question, for instance, the political aspects of gender equality, among other things, that sort of open discourse wouldn't be allowed in so many other places where the religion, where the state is ultimately involved in coercing particular religious interpretations and banning others. And so when it comes to the American approach and what I think and what ultimately what it means to me is this idea of free and open discourse and this place where we can interpret religion freely, and in the course of that, be able for religious thought to evolve and allow us to be truer, more genuine adherents for whatever religious faith we belong to. Of course, in recent years, especially in post 9/11, in the post 9/11 community, there are certain aspects of the American political discourse as they relate to Islam that are becoming increasingly problematic. And so while I have this really positive experience, there's also, I acknowledge the less positive aspects. For instance, there are increased political rhetoric that Islam and Muslims are somehow inherently dangerous, or this idea that Sharia is some sort of bogeyman. In recent months, we've seen, for instance, Oklahoma pass a bill to ban Sharia arbitration. And then just a few weeks ago, we saw a bill in Tennessee that basically was postulating that following Sharia should be a felony. And then the fact that there's similar bills like this in so many other states across the country. And that's ultimately quite troubling on a number of different levels. And the way that I deal with it, ultimately, I think that it helps to be a constitutional lawyer. This is where my other hat as an international lawyer at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty comes in handy, in the sense that I see the constitutional protections that I have. And so while I'm troubled by the discourse, I'm troubled by these measures that are being put out there, ultimately I know when they are challenged, that they won't be able to withstand constitutional scrutiny. Because of the inherent sort of structure in our constitutional framework that protects religious diversity and the free exercise of religion. It also comes in handy that I'm an editor and that I'm somebody who is overseeing a vibrant space for discourse, and I can appreciate the role of speech. And this is where I differ a bit from Imam Rauf, in the sense that I think that when it comes to these things, this so-called defamation, as some people call it, Imam Rauf called it libel, or insults or mockery of religion, I'm less troubled by that, because I see the role of countering that with good speech. And I can see ultimately in terms of legal consistency how it's important to have these broad free speech protections, because it's really difficult to draw lines sometimes between what constitutes mockery, for instance, and what doesn't, and what constitutes mockery for some people and not for others. And so when we think about aspects of the American approach that are worthy of emulation, it is precisely this broad protection of free speech that I think, among many other things, are most worthy of emulation. For instance, in Egypt, there's certainly an opportunity for change. Under the Mubarak regime, we saw a very strict control of religious interpretation, and we saw surveillance of mosque sermons, for instance, and the wide use of blasphemy laws to punish both particular religious interpretations that the state found threatening to its existence, but also political speech. Many of you might know, familiar with Egypt, the case of Karim Umar, the 22-year-old blogger who was put in jail for 4 years simply for criticizing not just Al-Azhar but also the president, and the fact that these occurred under the blasphemy laws. And so when I think about the ways that Egypt can begin to reform itself and to use a lot of the sorts of broad free speech protections that we see in the U.S., I think about the role of that protection in America's own struggle for freedom, and the role of religious rhetoric in fueling, for instance, the revolution and the abolition movement and then our own civil rights movement. And so in terms of Egypt, I really hope that the direction that it's going in is that it allows for this free and open space for religious discourse, as religion is very important to the Egyptian people, and many of them are very religious. And I think that by allowing free and open discourse, it can really push Egypt towards greater progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our three speakers. We have a lot of issues to cover and still a good amount of time left for open discussion. I thought I would lead it off by posing a a question that comes to me after listening to Imam Rauf's presentation, but I think the others on the panel may want to respond and also use this opportunity perhaps to respond to one another's presentations before we open things up. And that's this idea of the politicization of religion. And I would argue somewhat provocatively that that's built into the American system, the freedom to profess but also to engage in the political system on a religious basis with religious arguments as religious organizations. And we see it manifested in running conflicts, political conflicts about where to draw these lines between church and state. We see it manifested around so-called culture wars issues that have been mentioned already on this panel and the last one, stem cell research, abortion and the like, where religious commitments and identities play into the political sphere. Religion gets politicized in a way. So perhaps to Imam Rauf to sort of let us know where he draws a line between healthy engagement in politics on the one hand and what he calls politicization, but also to all the panelists, how important this distinction is as we think about the emerging role of religion in what look to be new democracies in the Arab world.
Thank you. It's the issue of separation does not mean a firewall between, the concept of the separation of powers that we have in the United States does not mean that the judiciary and the legislative and the executive branches of government are completely firewalled from each other. It is really but there is a structured formula that describes the relative roles of the executive branch, the legislative branch, etc., regarding, let's say, appointment of judges and who approves the judges. What we need is a similar description of the balance of powers and the role of each entity in the development of a healthy society. I'm not saying that there should be a complete firewall. I believe very strongly that the ethics and principles which come from our faith, it do inform and must inform the political process. It is hard in a few minutes to amplify this, but I think this is the unfinished business. Of all countries, of both the Western world as well as the Muslim world, is what is the right relationship? And this is how I describe it even. What is the right relationship between institutions of political authority and power and institutions of religious authority and power? This is the unfinished business which we need to look at. But there's some things which are very clear. To me, at least, they're very clear. The coercive powers of the state should not be used to oppress one religion. Things like that. The politicization in a way that creates harmony, that creates a sense of. I don't believe the concept of a nation state around a homogeneous set of definitions is something that is ethically correct. In fact, the problems which have arisen in much of the Muslim world over the past century was because of the creation of new identities around the new concept of a nation state. The concept of rule, which goes back to the discussion that on the previous panel of the fact that the concept of rights that don't exist in Judaism nor in Islam. And I wrote a paper on this, which is being published right now in the Law Journal of University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, is to me because of a certain way of language. We speak in Jewish law, in classical Jewish law, and classical Islamic law, we speak of ontologically real entities as being speakers. We speak of God, we speak of the Prophet, we speak of jurists. We don't speak of the state as a speaker. We don't speak of the Quran as a speaker. We have now created entities, corporate entities, which are speakers and actors. We ask, what does Islam say? Rather, this language is modern. It only occurred even in the Arab Muslim world in the last 2-3 centuries. We also, what does God say? What did the Prophet say? And this implies nuance, implies differences of opinion. So there are many reasons which have contributed to what I call the mishmash of understanding and not understand the dynamics by which actually things happen. There was a greater wisdom in some respects a century ago. But now new nation states which really are not working. The Europe today is shifting from a paradigm of what I call monoculturalism to multiculturalism, multi-ethnicism, which is why we see the problems happening in Europe today. The United States is better configured because we have a fundamental structure of multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity, and so forth. So these are part of the issues which are important in looking at who are we as a people. What part does religion play in it, and what are the other components, and that religion is a matter of belief, and you can have different beliefs within an overarching set of beliefs which are important. I'm sorry, I'm trying to shoehorn too many things into this discussion because they all relate to what I call the physics of the problem. But these are things we have to think through. But what is clearly wrong is clearly wrong. What's clearly right is clearly right. And yeah, there's going to be some gray areas in the middle. But that's the homework assignment we have for us in the future.
Thank you. Would either of you like to maybe
I just want to say a couple of things. I mean, firstly, there's been a vibrant debate within the global Muslim community over the last 60 years in particular. I think two strands. One is an ideas strand, and secondly, there's a scholarship strand. If we start with the scholarship strand, a name that's often forgotten, and I think sadly, is the name of Husain Ahmad Madani, M-A-D-A-N-I, who was sort of a great Deobandi scholar in India who had millions of followers. And before Pakistan was created, he opposed the creation of Pakistan as a religious state on religious grounds. He wanted Muslims of India to remain part of India. He was a scholar who was devoutly religious, who had millions of followers, who still commands millions across India, and was a secular democratic politician in the Indian National Congress, who was a contemporary of Gandhi. He and his kind of religiously rooted yet secular engagement with the Indian state was opposed by the other name that we may know about, which was Maududi, the founder of the Pakistani Jamaat-e-Islami organization, the godfather of modern Islamism. It was from Maududi that we got these ideas of having an Islamic state, that somehow a secular state was problematic, that sovereignty, or what's in Arabic called siyada, sovereignty is for God and not for people. This idea first comes about from Maududi, who then supports the state of Pakistan in its creation. Those two ideas of those two scholars, Husain Ahmad Madani representing the more traditional, what's now known as the Deobandi, but in those days, relatively mainstream, moderate, secular, religiously rooted engagement with politics, vis-a-vis the Maududi stroke Jamaat-e-Islami stroke Islamist engagement with politics, emerged in that period. Later on, Sayyid Qutb in Egypt borrows heavily from Maududi's ideas. If you read Jules Capelle or Olivier Roy, you will find the evidence for that. And then Qutb creates what we know in terms of a takfiri, domineering, opposition-focused, confrontational, anti-West, anti-Israel kind of Islamic state. Now, that's the debate among the scholars, but the two ideas that determine the kind of religiosity that we ought to see in the public space or not, and I'm talking here in specific for Muslim-majority countries with a focus on the Middle East in particular, is two things. One, whose sovereignty is most important? Is it we the people, or is it this notion that somehow hakimiyya, or that God is somehow sovereign? Now, this notion of God being sovereign, or siyada lillah, is again a new concept in the Muslim majority countries. It's not rooted in 1400 years of a tradition. Now, that's the first test. In other words, whoever enters the political fray within a religious framework ought to respect that it's people who are sovereign, that it's people who make laws, and within the rule of law, it's the democratic culture that ought to be upheld, and not any individual cleric or organization or whimsical interpretation of religion. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is the role of Sharia. Is Sharia, as Imam Feisal Rauf spoke about, just the penal code, or is it more than that? In other words, justice and the maqasid discussion that we spoke about earlier. So once those two issues are settled, then I think the role of religious organizations in the public domain can be a healthy one. And we shouldn't hammer the Muslim Brotherhood too strongly for wanting to at least have its leanings on a religious background, because if Christian Democrats can have it in Germany and in other places, where is the harm in an AK party type organization? Yes, we might have foreign policy difficulties with them. Yes, they may have issues towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. Yes, they may not speak our language on oil and terrorism in Israel. But if that's the kind of party in the short term Egyptians want to see at least participate in, say, 25–30% of the parliamentary bloc in a future Egypt, we should not be the first to be intervening and saying, you've made the wrong choice, because the more we demonize those kind of organizations, the more they end up lionized in the Arab street, and we ought to be conscious of that and allow for Egyptians to go through their own process of reaching, a stable pluralist democracy.
Thank you very much. Both those contributions really helped to further frame and focus our discussion. We have time now for questions from the floor. We have 2 roving mics. I'd ask you to identify yourselves briefly, stand up, and then pose a brief question so that we can get as many in as possible. So there's one here and then one here to start.
Would they direct it to
Hi,
somebody?
my name is Sarah Zaman. I'm with Voice of America. My question is pretty much along the lines of what was just now discussed. It's about religious political parties, particularly in the context of Muslim-majority countries. In Pakistan, political parties yield a certain level of, they have a certain level of legitimacy and pressure on the government. So even though the government itself is not really pushing for a certain kind of religion, religious political parties do have a certain legitimacy in Pakistan. How do you see that in Muslim-majority countries? How legitimate and how healthy do you find the existence of religious political parties, whether it be Pakistan or Egypt? That's basically the legitimacy, and how appropriate is it?
All right, let's collect one more question right over here. This gentleman right here.
Yeah, my name is Stan Watson. I live in Northern Virginia. And I'm just interested in this issue of the politicization of religion that was mentioned. It seems to me that equating apostasy with treason is quintessentially the politicization of religion. And yet Imam Feisal suggested that there was a time when that was necessary, and that's why the Prophet at one time equated apostasy with treason, but yet it's no longer necessary, I guess. And I'm trying to figure out, when is it necessary to equate apostasy with treason and therefore politicize religion, and when is it okay not to within a Muslim majority society?
Okay. Would you like to start in on that question?
Sure.
And then
On this one question or both questions?
you can do both, but we should try to be brief to
Sure.
get as many in as we
Well,
can.
I mean, you asked, let me take the second question, so you answer to that one. The Prophet not said, there was no sense that apostasy is necessary to be a capital crime. I'm just saying that historically, what happened was, when there was a state of war between the Meccans and the Prophet's community in Medina, those who apostatized, the apostasy in that time happened to be an issue of treason. It was the emerging of those concepts. Now, it was not really apostasy per se. I forgot the term, the legal term that Professor Ghazi mentioned, but it was a conflation. It was really treason which was the issue, not apostasy per se. So apostasy is not itself a cause it's not a capital crime. It's treason which is a capital crime. In a historical context, when it was associated with treason, that's how the origins of it, and that's why people think of it as being capital crime. It's an error. It's an error. I hope that clarifies that issue. On the issue of the legitimacy of Islamic political parties, my concern with that is that until the definition of what it's really all about, there's a danger. And which is why we have the notion of separation of church and state, or the separation of religion and politics, however you want to define it, as my friend Professor Mazrui defined it. the history hasn't been positive on that. I think we're all happier in societies where there is what we call in America a separation. In the way we practice, not that there is a real firewall between the two, that the ethical principles that we're allowed to lobby for principles that we believe are our own. And maybe there are ways to find solutions to that in ways that different religious communities can practice their faith without stepping on the toes of the others in a way that they feel they are happy. But I personally am not comfortable, and the proof of the pudding is that Islamic political parties have not in Pakistan gained more than about 10-15% maybe of the vote. But I've seen Malaysia, for example, the problems that it has created, that passed, the political party in Malaysia has created for UMNO, which is also a Malay party, and the Malays are Muslims. It has created a more politicized discourse around the issue of religion. It has created problems between the Muslims and the Chinese, some predominantly Buddhist and other faith traditions. And I don't think it is inconsistent with the very fundamental overriding principles of Islam. And just to comment briefly on what you said, our scholars had differences of opinion upon this too. Some said Rashid Rida was the first to mention the concept of Islamic State, and even Kamaluddin al-Afghani before in the late 19th century. But all of this is only about a century old. We talked about proper caliphate. And the idea of God's law, okay, God is sovereign, but we say in this country we're a nation under God. But how is it manifested? How is God's sovereignty manifested on earth? And this is what our scholars said was manifested by two things. The will of the people, which is why the concept of bay'ah, which is the pledge of allegiance, which today would be the democratic election of a people, and the removal of people from power. And and the jurisprudence and the law, so which parallels in many ways the system we have in the United States. This is why I think it would be very helpful for us to see how to create a mapping, what we call in mathematics a mapping, between Islamic principles and the systems that we have, let's say, in the United States and other countries, which is part of the work that I've been engaged in. And when you look at it from a substantive point of view, the principles and the similarities are really important and instructive.
Asma? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to further address the apostasy question, because I think there might still be a little bit confusion. I mean, granted, I think that when in the beginning of the community, when it was growing, it was very, as a political community, there were many times when apostasy coincided with treason as well. But I just to clarify a little bit on the fact that they're not one and the same. And when it was just a matter of belief, and it wasn't accompanied by sort of additional acts of aggression, it wasn't subject to the death penalty. And the interesting thing about that is that women as a group were exempted from that rule as well, which goes back to this idea that this additional element was needed in order for it to constitute treason.
Thank you very much. All right, let's take a couple more questions. There was one over here and one over here. And is there a student who has a question? All right, students, keep thinking about it. All right, there's a hand out back there. So we'll start over here on the left, up front, and then towards the back. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, please indicate that.
My name is Lauren Homer. I'm an attorney who's worked with countries in transition on reforming their laws affecting religious activities. And I guess all eyes are on the Middle East right now and the tremendous transitions that are going on there, a time of great hope and a time of great concern about how this is going to turn out. I agree with everything the panel said about the positive aspects of the Islamic approach to governance, but in reality, we've seen a lot of very negative things, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, which started out on a path to democracy, but it's turned out that there's been a tremendous amount of oppression of minority religions. And my question to the panel is, what actors within the Muslim world, whether nation states, intergovernmental organizations, regional organizations, schools of thought or NGOs are going to be working to promote and advocate for religious freedom in Egypt, Tunisia, hopefully Libya, and other countries as they shake off totalitarian regimes? And what do you think the prospects are for that happening? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Virginia Ferris with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Imam Rauf, you had talked about the Islamic State being an incoherent idea and how, as you got together with fellow imams to talk about how to define what an Islamic State might be, that there was also a difference of opinion. So I guess my question is, in looking at some of the criteria that you proposed as having derived from this conversation you had with fellow religionists, what prospects are there for the various Islamic countries to accept that criteria, and what do you think the future might be in terms of advancing those criteria among the different countries that define themselves as Islamic states?
Thank you. A third question. A student back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Casey Oyenija, and this question is directed towards Imam Feisal Abdul Rauf. I know earlier in the lecture, most of the panels were talking about the role of American politics and religion, and how the American society is a model for other countries to follow in their ways that they structure both religious and political processes. I know Asma Uddin, she talked about the growth of like the Muslim community post 9/11 and getting involved with many different types of civil society processes and being a part of this democratic process in a pluralistic nation. I was just wondering, what type of role do you see Muslim Americans playing in terms of being instruments of change in the political processes of the Middle East that are occurring right now, in terms of trying to help them transition in towards more democratic and open and pluralistic structures?
Thank you. Those are excellent questions. We've got three. There's something for each of the panelists to respond to, I think. Ed, could you get us started?
On the question of religious freedom and actors in quote-unquote the Muslim world, I mean, I ought to be, I'm not altogether comfortable with the idea of the Muslim world. I think much like the decline of Christendom, what we're seeing is essentially different Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries emerging in different ways. And we're seeing a great degree of pluralism, the kind of transparency we haven't had in Muslim majority countries for centuries. I think it's wrong for Western policymakers and others to talk about the Muslim world as a monolith, but I take the point that we're talking about a certain part of the world that shares that commonality in belief. And the other problem I have with the Muslim world reference is that it puts, quote unquote, the Western world in juxtaposition to or in opposition to the Muslim world. And those are, I think, false challenges and flawed premises. But religious freedom actors, I think the most important thing that guarantees religious freedom in any country is the culture of and the adherence to the rule of law. And it's essentially what happens to a Coptic Christian in Egypt who's discriminated against on the basis of his or her faith. What recourse does he or she have? Now, no matter how many civil society organizations and trade unions and others think that they can represent religious freedom in those countries, essentially if the rule of law is not on the side of the individual, then that individual has very little recourse to manifest his or her religious freedom. Now, for me, that's the most important player in the insurance that individuals have and communities have religious freedom. And in those countries, particularly Arab countries, we haven't seen the strong emergence of the rule of law on the side of religious minorities and indeed women and others. So going forward, I think, I'm sorry to sound more sort of future-orientated than present-orientated. I think the way forward is to have a stronger way of ensuring that the rule of law supports individual expressions of religious freedom and group expressions too. That said, in Egypt, in stark contrast to, say, Saudi Arabia, people enjoy greater religious freedom as they do, say, in Syria, in stark contrast to Iran. So each Middle Eastern country is broadly different. And the final point I'd make is it's an irony that the organization that's been most vociferous in the public domain in Egypt, talking about the need for religious freedom broadly, with a few exceptions, happens to be the Muslim Brotherhood. And I say this as a critic of the Brotherhood, not a friend. It's they who, over the last a decade and more, have repeatedly talked about the importance of human rights, human dignity, and by extension, the rights of religious minorities. So I think the voices in civil society are there in Egypt. The Coptic community has a strong political presence, but it's ultimately the rule of law that guarantees group and individual religious freedom.
Thank you. Imam Rauf?
Yes. Let me talk about the questions in one story. I do believe that the U.S. Muslims have a role as instruments of change. I believe that this parallels the role of American Catholics in bringing about Vatican II and the role of American Jews as interlocutors between this country and global Jewry. And there's no doubt in my mind, as the American Muslim community matures and develops its own institutions, it will become an increasingly potent interlocutor between the United States and the Muslim world. We have seen this already happen, especially now, more rapidly now in a time of immediate communications and the internet and Twitter, etc. There's no doubt that what has happened in the Muslim world has been inspired in many respects by what the youth have seen in the United States and Western Europe. The United States has had a profound influence upon the emergence of different forms of democracy. There's no doubt in my mind, and many people share this, that it was the American Revolution which brought about the French Revolution, which prompted the British to develop a bicameral government and share power in the House of Commons as well as the House of Lords. And I think these are the examples that perhaps the Saudis and other monarchies in the Muslim world will begin to think of and adopt. The discussion in our group of scholars separated the issue of mechanisms from deliverables. So therefore, the issue of whether a state declares or whether a state is a republic or a monarchy were considered different forms in which a so-called Sharia-compliant state may manifest itself. What was important is that what does it deliver? And to the scholars, and one thing which is important is we need to translate, to be effective, we need to translate our concepts of freedom or democracy into the vocabulary and nomenclature of Islam. So when we speak about the rule of law, to Muslim scholars, it's the Sharia. The rule of Sharia is the Muslim way of saying the rule of law. And if we want to deliver the specifics, I mean, I've suggested, for example, why not raise a case? I mean, the way we have made changes in this country is to go before a Supreme Court and argue that the Constitution intends thus and thus. I mean, when Marshall Brager was talking about, the intent of the original intent of those who drafted the Constitution, what did they have in mind? And we have to follow what they had in mind. This is so we argue our case in our courts within that system of law to bring about the desired changes. We need to do the same kinds of things in the Muslim world. So let's say if you want to establish a church in Saudi Arabia, there are different ways to do it. You can apply political pressure, but the most effective way would be to try and successfully raise a lawsuit under Islamic law. Saying Islamic law requires, and here's the verse and chapter, or chapter and verse of the Quran, the Prophet's teachings, the examples of the precedents of the great caliphs and scholars protecting such and such, and therefore the expatriate Christians should have a place of worship in Riyadh or Jeddah or Saudi, wherever they happen to be. This is how we can bring change, by utilizing the very mechanisms that people regard. And, as you said, Ed, to bring about a more coherent definition, understanding of what Islamic statehood is all about. protection of ethnic minorities. We protected ethnic minorities throughout our history. So the treatment of Copts in the in Egypt has been shameful. The attacks upon other faith traditions in Iran is un-Islamic, is against Islamic law. So we should apply that law to do that. And these are the types of actors that we can hopefully bring to play. And as an Egyptian myself, of Egyptian parenthood, to me the image in Tahrir Square of someone holding up the Quran and next to him a person holding up the Coptic cross, to me was very, very moving. That to me was symbolic of the natural inclination in the hearts and minds of the Egyptian people and of all people to live in the way we live here in America and the West. And this is why I think the example of the West. And mind you, when you watch the television interviews of people who are speaking, most of the people who speak English in the youth speak with American accents.
Ironically, yes.
The occasional British, the occasional British accent.
Yeah, I know.
But the vast majority of them speak with American accents. Well, Ghunaim is the representative of Google. So talk about American influence. It's not just, this is just a symbol of the substantive ways in which we live that people there want to live. Thank you.
Thank you. Asma?
Well, regarding the question about groups in Egypt that can help with the process of religious freedom and the prospects of that, I would start by saying that religious leaders and religious organizations themselves have to play a critical role in that process. First and foremost, because religion does play such a central role in the lives of so many Egyptians and the society collectively, and so I think first and foremost, they and their roles and their ultimately the credibility that they have will be central in bringing about fundamental change. And secondly, I agree with Ed in the sense of the rule of law, and also, but more specifically, the fact that there has to be legal changes. And the proper sort of laws need to be in place with also a deeper understanding of the principles that drive these sorts of broad, again, I go back to broad free speech laws and other components of religious freedom and religious expression. I would say that there needs to be laws in place that not only protect that, but also a sort of greater understanding of that. And in my own, if you want, like in terms of specific groups and my own interactions with Egyptian activists, I can definitely name at least two. There's actually three. There's an Arabic Network for Human Rights Information. There's Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. There's a Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. And all of these are highly sophisticated groups that have a really deep understanding and also engage beyond the domestic sphere and are quite involved at the level of the UN. And then just connected to that is this question of what role do American Muslims play in this process of transition. And I think ultimately we play the critical role of bridge builders. And in this process of understanding some of these principles and the core sort of rationale behind some of our laws, I think that our experiences here, especially the type that I discussed during my talk, is precisely the sort of experiences that we need to be sharing with individuals in these other countries. There's a concern often about broad freedoms and what are the limits to those freedoms. There's a preoccupation with limits. And because, for instance, some of them dealing with this question of mockery of religion, for instance, and there's a concern of many people in the Muslim majority countries when they see acts of Islamophobia, for instance, and this idea that somehow the society is really hostile to Islam and Muslims here. And I think that in negotiating that and trying to show them the relevance and importance of broad protections, but also how to begin to define limits and whether those and where those limits should be placed, I think the experience here is nuanced enough that in sharing that and trying to show that and allowing for the so-called mockery and so is in itself not the stopping point, but to show that how in the process of counteracting that we grow as a society and we develop greater social responsibility. And so I sort of like the before and after parts of the laws, those sorts of experiences are essential to share.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're running low on time, so I'm going to take the privilege of asking the last question. And I want to ask it of Imam Rauf. It's something that didn't come up in the question and answer, but I know is on people's minds. Our topic is the role of religion in politics and society in America. And of course, you've been at the center, you're still at the center of a controversy surrounding the project to build this Islamic center in New York. I wonder if you could share a couple of reflections about what you've learned so far about Islam in America and about some of the challenges and obstacles that you see lying ahead.
Well, thank you. Ever since I founded the Cordoba Initiative after 9/11 to bring about a turning point in U.S.-Muslim relations by creating and implementing projects and programs, one of which was the Cordoba House Project, which is intended as a multi-faith center, a center which belongs to everybody, just like the 92nd Street Y. The YMCA today is not really a Christian organization in the sense that only Christians are allowed there, but something which under a program similar to that would allow the whole community to participate, feel ownership, and to seed a culture of a community that is harmonious, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, etc., and celebrates its diversity, which is, I think, certainly the divine intent as expressed in our scriptures. What I have learned is a lot. I have learned that church and state are not always separated, even in America, and you can be a victim of midterm political, objectives, which is why our project was attacked. But what heartened me so much was the incredible rallying around of everybody from our political leadership, religious leadership, the community, the interfaith community, men and women in the street. It was just incredibly heartwarming. We received tens of thousands of letters of support in spite of the hostility from every state in this country and 46 countries around the world, including Israel. I learned that there are different kinds of correctness. Some things I've learned through my life is that there are different kinds of correctnesses. Just as you are concerned with legal correctness, there's also ethical correctness, religious correctness, sartorial correctness, emotional correctness, and success is political correctness, and success is balancing or optimizing all these arenas of correctnesses. You can be legally correct and dead because you've passed through somebody passed through a red light wrongly. So you have to, and in our work, one of the things that I've learned also is how important it is, in my work especially, to also factor in the perceptions that people have in other parts of the world. My mission is about creating harmony and creating peace between the United States and the Muslim world. It was so heartening to me when I was on my State Department trip to observe how the visuals and the optics of the Jewish mayor of the largest Jewish city in the world supporting the idea of what people, our opposition, called the Ground Zero mega mosque, did in the Arab and Muslim world. It raised the stock value of America. It raised then the headline in Egypt after the President Obama gave his iftar speech in the White House. My friend of mine called me an email and said, the banner headline on the front page was, Obama supports GZ Mosque. And the increase in stock value for American Jews, for what America stands for, and how gripping this was very heartwarming to me. So what I learned was that America is important to the world. How America engages with Islam, the Muslim world, is important to the Arab and Muslim world. And as important as it is to America and the West as well. We had people calling us from Europe saying, what is it about America which we in Europe need to learn, which is different about what you're doing? So these are among the lessons that we learned, and the dream is still alive, and we plan to do something that will optimally meet all of these different correctnesses, including the emotional correctness that people accused us of being insensitive to.
Thank you very much. And before I thank the panel, I want to note that we are going to feed you. We have a buffet lunch here, and we invite you to line up and get some food and return to your seats, because in about 10-15 minutes, we're going to hear a keynote address by Archbishop Charles Chaput of Denver, Colorado. So In conclusion, thank you all for being here, and let's thank our panel for a wonderful discussion.